Hi lovelies, welcome back to my channel. My name is Fola. If you are new here, thank you for stopping by, and if you are a returning subscriber, thank you for always coming back to my channel. In today's video, I'll be showing you how to make a two-piece. It's a trouser and a shirt. My trouser has an elastic waistband and two side pockets. And for my shirt, I have a long sleeve with a tie cuff at the wrist. I'm going to show you how to achieve that in this tutorial. If this is something you'd like to know more about, keep on watching and let's get right into the video. I'll be making use of this 4 yards of crepe fabric. For better understanding, I'll be drafting out on pattern paper before transferring to the fabric so that you can see clearly what I'm doing. I'll be drafting out my trouser pattern first. So the first thing I did on my paper was to rule my starting line. All my measurements will be starting from that point. From the starting line, I placed my hip line, which is 9 inches. Then I placed my crotch depth. To get your crotch depth, all you have to do is to divide your hip circumference by 4. Mine is 12.5. Then I just added ½ inch to that to make 13 inches. Then I placed the length of my trouser. The length of the trouser I'm working with is 42 inches. And I added extra 2 inches to that for hemming the down part of my trouser. Then I ruled out my lines. Then I placed my knee line. I forgot to add that earlier. So my knee line is 24 inches. And then I ruled that out. Then I labeled my lines. I have the waist, hip, the crotch, the knee line, and the length of my trouser. The next thing I'm going to do now is to place my horizontal measurements. On the waistline, I placed quarter of the hip circumference plus extra 1 inch for stitching. I placed my hip measurements on the waist because of the elastic I'm going to be adding to the waist. So by the time I add my elastic, it's going to gather up to my original waist measurements. Quarter of the hip circumference is 12.5 plus extra 1 inch, that is 13.5. I placed the same measurements on the hip line and on the crotch line. Then I connected the 3 points with a straight line. Then the next thing is to measure out my crotch extension. To get your front crotch extension, all you have to do is to divide your hip circumference by 20. So mine is 2.5. So all I did was to mark 2.5 from that line there. I placed 2.5 on the mark on my crotch line, just like that. So from that point, I'm going to connect to the rest of the line to form my crotch curve. I'll just connect with a curve, just like that. The next thing I'll do now is to mark my crease line. To get the crease line, what I'll do is to measure out what I have on the crotch line. From that point to the crotch extension, I'll measure out whatever I have there, and I'm going to get the midpoint. I'll get the midpoint. I'll mark out the midpoint just like that. Then I'll form a straight line all the way to the hem of the trouser. The next thing I'm going to do now is to place my knee circumference measurements on the knee line. My knee circumference is 25 inches. Then I'm going to add extra 1 inch to that for stitching. That will be 26 inches in total. So what I'm going to do is to place half of that on the knee line. Half of the knee circumference is 13 inches. So what I'm going to do now is to share the 13 inches on both sides of the crease line. So I'm going to place 6.5 inches on this side and 6.5 inches on the other side. Then I'm going to place the same measurements on the length also. 6.5 on this side and 6.5 on the other side. Then I'm going to connect my points together to form a straight line. I'm going to connect the knee to the length. It's my straight ruler. I'll do that to the other side also. Then I'll connect the crotch to the knee line also. Then I will connect the other side also to the knee line. With a slight curve, I'll connect the crotch to the knee. Just like that. So that will be all for the front pattern. All I'm going to do now is to cut out. I won't be cutting the waist directly on the line. I'm going to be leaving ½ inch above the waistline before cutting out. The ½ inch will serve as an allowance to join to my band later. Then I'm going to cut out. Then I put my fabric on fold and I pin my pattern paper on it. Then I traced out the same measurement I have on the pattern paper on the fabric and I cut that out. To cut out the back pattern, what I did was to place my fabric on fold and I placed my front pattern on it. And I added some inches to the back pattern to make it bigger than the front pattern. Then the next thing I did was to extend my crotch line like that. So I'm going to place my crotch extension on that line. To get your back crotch extension, you are going to divide your hip circumference by 10. Mine is 5 inches. So starting from that line, what I did was to place 5 inches on the crotch line. That is my back crotch extension. Then from the front waist, I came out by 2 inches, just like that. And on the hip line also, I came out by 2 inches. Then I'm going to connect the 3 points together to form my crotch curve. I'll connect the waist to the hip with a straight line. Then I'll connect the hip to the crotch with my curve. Then I'm going to come out by 2 inches along the inseam also. I'm going to mark 2 inches down to the hem of my trouser and I'll connect the points together. And I'll connect the crotch to the knee line also. And that will be all for the back pattern. All I'll do now is to cut out. Please pardon me if my chalk is not visible, but with my explanation, you are going to understand what I did there. And I'll go ahead to cut out now. So that is all for the pattern. The next thing I'll do now is to cut my pockets. For my pockets, I cut 2 pieces of fabric and I placed them right side facing each other. The width is about 15 inches and the length is 13 inches. Then I'm going to mark where I want my pockets to be on my front pattern. So what I did was to place my front pattern together, right side facing each other. And on the side seam, I came in by 2.5 inches from the waistline, just like that. And I came down by 6 inches. That will be for my pocket entry. So what I will do is to connect the point together with a curve. And you can also connect with a slanted line. And I'm going to cut that out. Then the next thing I will do now is to create the same shape I have on the trouser on my pocket also. So what I did was to place my trouser on the pocket, on one side of the pocket like this. Then I'm going to trace that same shape. Make sure the right side of your pockets are facing each other. And I'm just going to create that same shape on the pocket also. So that is all for my pocket also. This is how it's going to look like on our pockets. So I'll start joining my pieces together now. So the first thing I'm going to do is to join my pockets to the trouser. What I'll do is to open up my pattern and I'll place my pocket on it, right side facing each other. And I'm going to stitch along the pocket entry with ½ inch allowance. I'll do the same thing to the other side also. I'll place my pocket on it and I'll stitch with ½ inch allowance. This is what I have after stitching. What I'll do next is to fold my pockets over like this. And I'm going to stitch the down part with ½ inch allowance. And I'll do the same thing to the second side also. I'll fold my pockets into 2. And I'll stitch the down part with ½ inch allowance. So this is what I have after stitching. So I'm just going to drag this in like this. And I'll arrange that properly. I'm going to use my pins to hold down my trouser to the pocket. So this is the point where my hand is going to go through. You can as well run a straight stitch at the top and at the side just to hold down the pockets to the trouser. I already did that to the second side. So the next thing I'll do now is to sew my crotch. I'm going to place my trouser right side facing each other, and I'll sew the crotch with 1/2 inch. And I'll do the same thing to the back crotch as well. I'm going to place them right side facing each other, and I'll stitch the crotch with 1/2 inch. So this is what I have after stitching, and I went ahead to iron my seam opened. Then the next thing I'll do now is to place my front on the back, right side facing each other, and I'll match the crotch with a pin. I'm going to use a pin to pin down my crotch, and I'm going to sew the inseam with 1/2 inch allowance. Starting from the crotch, I'll stitch with 1/2 inch allowance on both sides. After sewing the inseam, I'm going to stitch the side also with 1/2 inch allowance. I'm going to stitch both sides with 1/2 inch allowance. I'm going to place them like that, and I'll stitch with 1/2 inch allowance. So this is what I have after sewing. I've gone ahead to stitch the inseam and the sides, and I gave it a good press. And I also went ahead to stitch the hem of my trouser 1 inch twice. So the next thing I'll do now is to work on the band. I'm going to measure around what I have on the waist. I have about 58 inches. So I went ahead to cut a long strip of fabric that is about 59 inches. I added 1 inch to the 58 inches. And the width is 4 inches. That is 2 inches on fold. And I closed the opening on the band with 1/2 inch allowance. So I'm left with the exact 58 inches I need for this. So the next thing I'll do now is to sew the bands to the trouser. So what I did was to turn my trouser to the wrong side, and I'm going to place my band, one side of the band facing the wrong side of my trouser. I'll make sure I match the seam I have on the band with the center seam I have on my trouser. I'm going to pin that down, and I'm going to stitch round the band with 1/2 inch. So this is what I have after stitching my band down. What I'll do now is to turn it to the right side. I pressed down 1/2 inch on the band. I used my iron to press down 1/2 inch. So what I'll do is to fold my band over like this. So what I'll do is to fold my band over like this, and I'll use that to cover the seam I have there, and I'll make a stitch round the band. That will become like a casing for my elastic. I'm going to make a stitch round the band. So this is what I have after stitching, and I left about 2 inches on the band. I didn't stitch that completely, so I'm going to be passing my elastic through that opening. So this is my elastic. What I did was to deduct about 6 inches from my waist circumference, and I used that to cut out my elastic. So I'm going to pass that through the channel. I'm going to use my safety pin to pass my elastic through the casing. So this is what I have after adding my elastic, and I closed up the opening where I passed my elastic through. And that will be all for the making of the trouser. So we are going to move on to the making of the shirt now. So I'm going to be drafting the shirt out on pattern before transferring to the fabric. I already made my marks on the pattern. I'm just going to explain to you what I have here. I have the shoulder to the chest line, which is 9.5. I have my shoulder to the waistline, and I have my shoulder to the length of the shirt, and I added 1 inch hemming allowance to the shirt. I'm going to place my horizontal measurements now. I placed half of the shoulder measurements on the shoulder line and on the chest line. and I connected the points with a straight line. Then I marked my neck width, which is 3 inches, and the front neck depth is 3 inches as well, and I connected the 2 points with my curve. Then I came down by 1 inch from my shoulder line, and I connected that to the neck width to form my shoulder slope. Then I got the midpoint of what I have left, and I came in by 0.5 inch. Then on the chest line, I placed quarter of my bust circumference, which is 11 inches, and I added 1.5 inches for ease before adding 1 inch for my side seam allowance. Then I connected the points to form my armhole. On the waistline, I placed quarter of my waist circumference plus 1.5 inches for ease. Then I added 1 inch for my side seam. And on the length of my shirts, I placed quarter of my hip circumference, and I added 1.5 inches for ease and 1 inch for my side seam allowance. Then I connected the points together. Then I'll connect the waist to the length also. Then on the hem of my chest, I came up by 2 inches. Then I'll connect that point to the down part, just to have a slight curve at the hem of my shirt. So I'm just going to connect that point like that. So that will be all. All I'll do now is to cut out. I'll be using the same pattern to cut out my back also. So what I'll do now is to place my back neck depth, which is 1 inch. Then I connected it with a curve. I connected it to the neck width, just like that. So I'm going to be cutting out the back neck first. So I'll go ahead and use this to cut out my back on fabric. So this is it. I've gone ahead to cut out my pattern of fabric. My back pattern was cut on fold, and I added ½ inch allowance around the neckline, the shoulder line, and the armhole of my shirt. Then I'm going to remove my pattern from the fabric. So what I did was to cut out the neckline of my front, and I'll use that to cut out my fabric. So I placed my fabric on fold, and I placed my pattern paper on it. I made sure I have 3 inches allowance before I placed my back pattern on it. That will serve as my button allowance. Then I extended my neckline with a straight line. I extended it to the button allowance. Then I cut out. I made sure I leave ½ inch allowance around the neckline, the shoulder line, and the armhole as well. I left ½ inch allowance around the armhole. So this is my front pattern. I went ahead to add interfacing to the wrong side. I added interfacing to the button allowance, to the 3 inches that we left. I added interfacing to that part, and I folded that part in 1 inch twice, and I used my iron to make a crease line there. And I did the same thing to the second side also. So what I'll do now is to run a stitch on that part, like that, to hold it down. I'll do the same thing to the second side also. I'm going to run a stitch to stitch down my button allowance. Then the next thing I'll do after that is to join the shoulders. I'm going to place right side of the front facing the right side of the back. Then I'm going to stitch them at the shoulders with ½ inch allowance. This is what I have after stitching down my button allowance and my shoulders. So the next thing I'm going to do now is to fix my collar. So I'm going to fold my neckline like this. I'll fold them into 2, and I'll measure round the neckline. I took notes of the back neckline. The back neckline is 3.5 inches on fold, and what I have in total for my neckline is 9.5 inches on fold. I'm going to use that to cut my collar. So I'm going to be drafting out the collar stand first. So I rule a line at the side and the bottom of my paper to indicate my starting line. So from the starting line, I'll mark my neck width, which is 9.5 inches. Then from that point, I'll come off by ½ inch. Then from the starting line, I'll place my back neck width. Remember, I measured 3.5 inches for my back neckline. So I'm going to mark 3.5 inches on that line. Then I'm going to connect that point to the ½ inch mark that I came up by. I'll connect it with a slight curve, just like that. Then the next thing I'll do now is to mark the length of my collar stand. So I want my collar stand to be 1 inch. So I'm going to mark 1 inch upward from the line I have there. I'll mark 1 inch and I'll follow the curve. I'll mark 1 inch at that end also. Then I'll connect the 3 points together. So that will be all for my collar stand. What I will do now is to blend the sharp edge around this point. I'm just going to give it a slight curve into the line, and that will be all. And I'm going to cut that out now. To cut my main collar now, I'm going to follow the shape I have on the down part there, and I'm going to mark the length of my collar, which is 2.5 inches. So I mark 2.5 inches upward, and I'll place the width of my neckline there, which is 9.5 inches. Then I'll connect the point with my ruler, just like that. And I connected that to the down part, just like that. Then the next thing I'll do is to come in by 1 inch from that point, and I'll connect it to the top with a slanted line like that, because our collar is not supposed to get to the collar stand, and that will be all. Then I'm going to cut that out. So that will be all. This is how it's going to be. So the next thing I'll do now is to go over to my fabric, and I'll cut out my collar on fabric. I'll be cutting them on fold. So I've gone ahead to cut out my collar on fabric. I cut it on fold. The center back was cut on fold, and I added ½ inch allowance round the pattern aside the center back that was cut on fold, and I cut 2 pieces each for my collar and collar stand. One will be serving as the fabric and the other one will be serving as the lining. And I added interfacing to the wrong side of one of the collar. So I placed my collar right side facing each other, and I'm going to stitch from this point here all the way round, and I'll stop at the second end. I'm going to stitch that with ½ inch. This is what I have after stitching my collar. I turned it to the right side and I gave it a good press. Then for my collar stand, I'm going to notch the center point. I'm going to notch that point. Then I'll fold my main collar also into 2, and I'll notch the center point also. Then I'm going to open up my collar stand, and I'll place the collar in between the fabric and the lining of the collar stand, and I'm going to pin them notched points to notched points. Then I'm going to stitch it from this end here with ½ inch. I'm going to stitch it all the way around, and I'll stop at the second point here. And I'm going to be left with the part that is going to go around the neckline. This is what I have after fixing my collar stand to the collar. You can see how neat everything is looking like. And I went ahead to iron in my ½ inch allowance. So I notched the midpoint of my collar, and I notched the midpoint on the neckline of my shirt also. What I'm going to do now is to match. I'm going to match one side of my collar to this at the center. I'm going to match it to the center of the shirt, and I'm going to stitch that starting from the center. I'm going to stitch it round my neckline. I'll stitch it to one of this side, and I'll stitch it to the other side also with my 1/2 inch allowance. This is what I have after stitching down. What I'll do now is to use the other end of the collar to cover up the rough edges I have there, just like that, and I'm going to stitch that down. So this is it after I was done stitching my collar to the shirt. The next thing I'm going to do now is to stitch my side seam. So I'm going to place my fabric right side facing each other, and I'm going to stitch the sides with 1 inch side seam allowance. I'm going to stitch that with my 1 inch allowance. I'll do the same thing to the other side also. Then I'm going to hem the down part of my shirt also, 1/2 inch twice. So this is what I have after stitching. I've gone ahead to stitch the sides, and I've hemmed the down part. So the next thing we are going to do now is to work on the sleeves. So I have my basic sleeve pattern here. I have a video already on the channel on how to draft your long sleeve pattern. You can check that out. So the length of my sleeve here is 25 inches. I added extra 2 inches to my normal long sleeve. So by the time I had my cuff, I'm going to have a little puff at the end. That is why I made my length to be 25 inches. Then another thing I did was to use what I have on my bicep line. That is what the same measurement I placed on my wrist entry. I didn't use my normal wrist measurements. I used what I have on the bicep line on my wrist line, so that by the time I had my cuff to that, I'm going to gather up the excess to my cuff. So that is why I made use of my bicep measurement on the wrist line. I went ahead to cut my sleeve on fabric, and I added 1/2 inch allowance to the top and to the bottom, and my sleeve was cut on fold. So I'm going to open up my sleeve. The first thing I'm going to do is to gather the down part of my sleeve to my wrist measurements. My wrist measurement is 9 inches. So I'll go ahead to gather the down part to 9 inches, and I'll leave 1 inch on both sides for joining. Then I went ahead to cut out a long strip of fabric for my cuff. It's about 45 inches long, and the length is 5 inches. That's 2.5 inches on fold. So what I'm going to do is to fold it over like this. I just want to get the midpoint. I'm going to fold it into 2 equal halves, and I'm going to notch it at the center. I'm going to notch the center point. Then I'm going to open it up. So from the notched points, I'm going to place my wrist measurements. Remember, my wrist circumference is 9 inches. Half of that is 4.5 inches. So I'm going to place 4.5 inches on both sides of the notched points. That is my wrist measurement. That is 9 inches in total. So what I'm going to do is to fold my cuff into 2. I'll stitch from one end, and I'll stop at the point where I marked. Then I'm going to stitch on the other end also with 1/2 inch, and I'll stop at the point, the second point that I marked, and I will be left with the part that is going to go around my wrist. So this is what I have after gathering my wrist. I went ahead to gather my wrist entry, and I also stitched my side seam with 1 inch. I didn't stitch that completely. I stopped about 4 inches below the wrist. I stopped stitching about 4 inches below the wrist. And I went ahead to stitch my cuff also, and I've ironed it. Then I'm left with the part that is going to go around my wrist. So I'm going to stitch that down to the sleeve now. So I'm going to place the wrong side of my sleeve facing one end of the band, and I'm going to pin that down. I'm going to arrange my gathers into the cuff like that. So I'm stitching to one end of the cuff first. I'm going to stitch that with my 1/2 inch like that. So this is what I have after stitching. So that's my stitch there. The next thing I'm going to do now is to cover up the rough edges with the other end of the cuff. I'm just going to cover it up like that, and I'm just going to stitch that down. I'm going to stitch that down like that. So I've done that to the second sleeve already, and this is what I have, and this is how it looks on the wrong side. You can see how neat everything is looking. This is how it looks. So the last thing I'm going to do now is to fix my sleeve to the shirt. That will be the last thing we are going to do for this shirt. I'm going to join my sleeve to the shirt, and that will be all. This is what I have after fixing my sleeve. So I'm going to mark the points where my buttonhole is going to be. My buttonhole will be fixed at the right side of my shirt, and the buttons will be at the left side of the shirt. So the spaces between them will be 3.5 inches. So that is what I'm marking on the button allowance now. We have come to the end of today's tutorial. I hope you found this video helpful. Please do not forget to like, share and subscribe to my channel. And also put on your notification bell so you'll be notified every time I upload a new video. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.